Resultados, buenas tardes, good evening. First I have to say it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to come here. I was extending my scope of presentation a little bit from the one which was proposed at the very beginning to focus only on XC2, but I was thinking that for the end of this life project, which has been actually mind-blowing in a way it has been done. So I tried to a little bit look on the European mean conservation in more general and global scale, and to show you the challenges that we see in our conservation work. And my structure of the talk is relatively easy. I'm going to look on the present situation, dividing into three parts: XC2, IN-situ, and policy. Policy because of many things actually depend upon the policy guiding the actions. And then I'm going to my vision, what are the main challenges which we have actually working on again in XC2, IN-situ, and the policy level. So first to the XC2. In XC2 we could look on the demography in captive condition, captive breeding. And as we can see, actually right now, if we took together the eastern population, which is the EP population, the zoo community-run population, and the western population, and under the western population I talk about the Spanish breeding program, we have 267 individuals in captivity as it stands in 13th of April 2017. So it seems to be a rather high number, and the number of institutions seems to be also quite high. But in reality, if I'm looking on the EP level, living outside the Spanish breeding program, we can see actually that very few institutions actually contribute in a committed way to the captive breeding. So right now, in this year 2017, the mink were born only in Tallinn and in Euronerz, which is a German-based facility. And usually we have also Riga breeding, but we don't have so many really focused breeding facilities which could contribute to the success of XC2 breeding program. And then we have Zodusset, which is a new breeding facility in France with a capacity around 60 animals, which could actually contribute quite remarkably to the increase of numbers in captivity. But so far, it has not been successful, but I'm pretty sure that the success will be achieved in a few years. So if you look on the development of the captive breeding programs, and I'm splitting it again into the EP program and the Spanish program, you can see that at the start it is a little bit struggling, and then finally we end up in a kind of carrying capacity level, which in the EP program is a bit more than 200 animals, let's say 240 animals, and then it's starting to fluctuate around that. Whereas in the Spanish program we can see steady increase, then decline, and it seems that right now we have the carrying capacity around 45 animals, which is not too much. If you look on the age distribution as it stands for 2017, I would say both sides are doing pretty well. And the eastern side, of course, it could be a little bit better in a size of the males, but I think what I can say it's probably right now much better than it was in 2017. What is also important to tell, if you look on the demography of the captive population, is of course a trend. What kind of trend we can see for the future if you look on what has happened before. And here we can see the trends in the EP population. And as you can see, if you look the dark dot lines, which is a deterministic model, it actually shows that if everything is going on in a way like it has been going, we could increase the population as much as we want to. And definitely we don't have any problems to keep it in a level of carrying capacity. And the same seems to be valid if you look on the deterministic models in the Spanish population. But then if you take into account the probability, the fluctuation, stochasticity, then we can see that actually there is a chance, negative chance, that the Spanish population alone could end up in extinction within some 15 years. At least it will be one possibility of development, which also actually shows you that the Spanish population alone, with this number like we have right now, might not be self-sustainable for a long time. Then let's go to the ex situ population and genetics. If you look on the genetics, first I have to say, talking about genetics, that while making an analysis, it's clear that the Spanish population has less gene diversity than the EP population. And to try to fit them into the same model, what we were doing, we used kind of analytical overlay. And just looking on the field data, the assumption was made that the kinship of all the founders of Spanish population is 0.375. That is something which have to be tested, but right now, based on these studies, we assume something like that. So if you look on the data on captive population, what we can see actually is that we have pretty high numbers of founders for the overall population. Together, if you lump the Spanish population and the EP population into one. But at the same time, if you look on the genetic diversity, the EP population is doing relatively well. It's relatively wealthy for the current moment. Whereas if you look on the western side, the Spanish population, they are actually quite closely related. And in long term, if you would like to maintain the gene diversity for 100 years, even if we lump all the population, we would be able to maintain only 72%, a bit more, gene diversity. In the EP population alone, it's a bit less than 70%, and the Spanish population level alone will be really very, very low. Which basically means that if you look on in the Western population, this kind of gene diversity means that the Western population will be much more inbred than full siblings. So what to do with this kind of situation? Basically, the only thing is, because the turnover of the population, the breeding of European mink is so fast, the generations are changing so fast, that we actually have to add to the captive breeding operation founders every now and then. And the possibilities to maintain the gene diversity, actually we have three different options. Either to try to get additional founders from wild populations, the population which are declining already. Then we could cryopreserve the gametes or stem cells. So in the future, these kind of stem cells could be a source of additional founders once the methodology will be in place. And finally, once we have reintroduced populations, we could joint manage the reintroduced population and the captive population, which is a little bit tricky right now, but I'm coming to that a bit later. One thing which I would like to draw your attention is that the EP program, which is a zoo-based captive breeding program, has made a change. And nowadays, the Zoo Association is actually regarding EP like a program which is trying to incorporate both ex situ and in situ part. Previously, it was looked only like an ex situ. And this kind of document was prepared for the beginning of this year, and that is kind of roadmap for the EP for the future. So what is the role of the EP in the future in case of European mink? What I have to say is that it has been prepared quite recently, but already now it's a little bit outdated because we have done quite a bit of things already, and that's a problem with all the documents which are trying to guide ongoing processes. They start to be outdated quite quick. So the role of EP program, like it is said right now, is of course to maintain genetically diverse, demographically healthy and behaviorally competent population. And also to support, to encourage, to help with surplus animals, restoration and establishment of viable wild populations. It's not only making viable population into the wild, but also to benefit of having captive population and wild population, because this kind of model actually allows us to ask a lot of research questions and to find replies to critically important problems what we have in conservation of this species. European mink is not a separated thing. It lives in the habitat, and the European mink can be viewed like a flagship species for small streams which are ecologically very important, but very often fully overlooked in overall conservation landscape as important ecosystem which we have to take care of. And of course we cannot do anything without education, because all the problems what we have outside in the wild is actually a reflection of what we have here. So in a long term, most important work is actually what we do with people's minds. And finally, a lobby in EU level or in different other levels working on a policy level just to make a suitable policy environment to do a good conservation work for the European mink. Then I would like to come to the trial, which Asun already was mentioning. It's not much to add what Asun was saying, but basically we changed the animals between Spain and Tallinn. We made a trial breeding. In Tallinn, we ended up in having 2 litters. One had 1 pup, the second one had 4 pups, and it was not working in Spain. Of course, these experiments is just to make sure that we don't have any kind of outbreeding events if we would like to join the Spanish population and the EP population. It might seem to be a little bit scary that there was no breeding going on in Spain, or the breeding in Tallinn was not, at least not so good as I was expecting. But then again, looking back into the history, when we were bringing animals to Tallinn from faraway places like Novosibirsk, these animals were not breeding well also from the first year. So it's probably we need some adaptation time, the animals to get adapted to the new conditions. And I'm pretty sure that the breeding is continuing in 2019, the trial. So we will probably see quite nice success in breeding. The second thing which is right now underway is actually to looking on gene diversity, Spanish captive population and the EP population, and to try to find out what we are doing, is it really right, or we could end up in some kind of mistakes. The study is underway, so we are still not done the proper analysis of data, so it's really complicated to show something. But we have 206 samples, and as you can see from the EP program, we have 153 samples, and from the Spanish population, 53. Some very few things what we have right now, we have used 13 markers. The number of alleles which we have found is for the eastern population 47 and 25 for the western population, and only 1 unique private allele for the western population. If you look on the heterozygosity, the difference is actually less than in the study made based on a wild population by Cabria. So we don't know what is causing that one right now. And we try to look also in breeding coefficients in population, but the values are not significant for Western populations. So right now we can't do any kind of conclusion, at least in current level. What else? We were looking also at the possible bottlenecks, and we couldn't find by using 3 different mutation models. But it's clear that we don't have enough markers. And the lack of sufficient number of markers actually raises the question that the European mink conservation work on a genetic level needs a study of European mink genome. Otherwise, we actually cannot make very good conclusions from our studies. The principal component analysis is actually dividing the Western population and the Eastern population into 2 parts. But again, it's only one unique allele, and the difference actually is based only on frequency. You might ask why the EP population is this kind of strange structure that you have. This part very densely populated, and this one is quite scattered one. That is actually the part which is coming from German breeding operation Euronerz, and the origin of these animals are coming from Russian Novosibirsk breeding operation. So we have not analyzed it properly, but it might be a result that the founders of this part are a little bit apart standing from those ones. We have to look at that. So the results are very provisional, but in most part, the results seem to confirm the Cabria studies. We definitely don't have enough markers, and I think the most important thing that we have to try to find out is how to quantify the gene diversity difference between the Eastern population and the Western population, because once we have that, we could actually use it in a proper way in making this analytical overlay in PM-mix model, which is the base of captive management. So in situ status. First, Estonia. I'm coming from, starting from my own country. There are 2 islands, Saaremaa and Hiiumaa. In Hiiumaa, we have established population, which is actually doing quite well. The number of positive plots are more or less the same. In 2018, it's the same level. And also the post-winter abundance is more or less the same. So we have not made additional releases from captivity. We could say that there is a wild population in the island. And what we were also doing, we were actually comparing the genetic diversity in island population and in Tallinn Zoo captive population. And we found slight differences. So in the future, one thing which has to be done in Estonia is actually to try to increase the genetic diversity in island population. The problem what we have right now with the island population is the extreme drought, which the full Estonia was suffering this year. That's one of the mink rivers without water. So basically, the fish is gone, small mammal abundance actually this year is incredibly low. So 2018 for the Hiiumaa population is kind of trial year. If the wild population is surviving this year, then we can say that the population is capable to survive extreme conditions and are prone to survive without human help for a long time. If not, then we have to support it. So plans for the future is basically release on the island and also to start the actions on a second island to make an island population in this one as well. France, I'm just making very quick review. For a long time it wasn't clear what's going on in France, but right now we know that the European mink is present in very, very small number. It has been found through the trapping operations, and that is actually calling to actions. Also, what has been relieved in the work in France, that the American mink population, which seemed to be a relatively small one in this southwestern part, has actually increased quite remarkably and is actually making quite a threat for the fragmented European mink population. So the mink rafts are network like in Spain is also started to put into work in France. So hopefully that will bring a good results. In Romania, we have not talked too much about Romania, but Romania is a critically important country in terms of the conservation of European mink. And that's because of the Danube Delta. That's 100 kilometer to 100 kilometer lagoons, canals, floating islands, amazing landscape. And it's clear that this area has European mink. The mission which we were conducting in 2014 actually resulted in finding out that it's its most viable population in the world. The size of the population could be just an estimate between 1,000 to 1,500 individuals. So being the most viable population in the world, definitely there is a need to make sure that it will survive for a long time. Unfortunately, the mink farming is starting to be a problem, because if it's easy to prohibit mink farming in one country which has a good legislation, and you could prohibit like in the Netherlands and UK. But the capital is actually looking for other possibilities of mink farming because of the increase of price, which is actually caused by the booming fur fashion in China. And because of that, the number of farms in Romania is increasing. And because of increasing of mink farms, it also means that there will be more and more escapees from the farms. And it's just a matter of time when these American minks are reaching to the Danube Delta, if they are not there already. So what has happened so far in Romania is that following the meeting what we had in Romania, Romanian NGOs have established a working group with a headquarters in Brasov Zoo, and they tried to work with the Ministry of Environment and also with the National Veterinary Agency just to get an idea what they can do, how they could have an impact to the situation. So on 28th of December, there will be a second meeting of this working group. And I really hope that we could hear some good news of the plans in Romania, because otherwise we are just losing this population. Russia, it's usually regarded to be a kind of stronghold of European mink, which unfortunately is not the case. The IUCN assessment, which was done in 2015, was actually drawing quite a murky picture of the situation. But what I would like to highlight here are two interesting new pieces of information. One was actually coming from north of Caucasia. From all of a sudden, we got really a good evidence of the presence of European mink. 2 animals were caught. So there is definitely a population, but we have no idea how good it is, how well it is preserved, how far are the American minks. We don't know anything about it. And the second interesting piece of information is actually coming very far from the original range of the European mink. It comes from Kuril archipelago, from the Far East. I don't know how much of you know it, but in 1980s, the release operation was going on in one of the islands, which is called Kunashir. And there has not been any good evidence about the result of that. So if the European mink historical range was something like that, here is the Kuril Island. So you could see from this island actually Hokkaido in Japan. And interestingly, actually in 2016, all of a sudden we got information through the trail cameras that there is European mink living so far away placed from the original range. And again, we have no clue how good is the population, how large is the population. We don't know anything. So from point of view of conservation of the species, it could be really important to get better understanding what's going on this island. So to Germany. Germany actually started interesting release project in Steinhuder See, which is kind of a natural area. They made a lot of releases, and the result of the release actually was really astonishing news. In 2015, in trail camera, they saw one wild-born European mink in Steinhuder See region. As far as I know, the German colleagues have financial difficulties to continue the project, so I'm not sure how well it is going to continue. And now to the policy issues. On a positive side, I would say, from a negative side first, of course. I think the main problem what we have actually is that we do not have any all-European action plan for the European mink. Every country is doing something himself. On a technical level, we do communicate quite a lot, but in the level of government and politicians, there is not too much communication. There is no coordination between actions. And what is also really pity is there is no political will for actions in Romania, and also not political wills in actions for in Russia and Ukraine right now. I think the recent advance in political level definitely is the inclusion of European mink into critically endangered species in Spain and in France, which means there will be obligations for the government to do something. And as we can see, the process is going on in these two countries. One thing which is definitely important to mention if we talk about the policy, and that brings back to the American mink, that the new regulation, actually it's not so new anymore, in 2015, EU invasive alien species regulation. And as you know, the core of this piece of legislation is actually the list of invasive alien species of union concern. And it's really important to get the American mink into this list. So the work is done for that. The risk assessment has been prepared. It has been tabled to European Commission by Portugal. But unfortunately, due to many different kind of reasons, and actually because of the political lobby work against the idea to add American mink into the list, the Commission decided to postpone to add any species to the list until the spring next year. And that might be quite bad news for the Romanian population, because the mink industry actually is developing in this country pretty fast. So the future challenges in situ conservation, like I see them. First, in Romania, I think the main problem what we have right in Romania is that there is not well-designed monitoring methodology in place. So we do know the Danube population is large, but how large it exactly is, we don't know. We don't know the trends. There is no much data available. The same is also about the presence of Carpathian population. There are certain evidence that there could be also population in Carpathian mountains, but we don't know how much. The issue of prohibition of mink farms in Romania is definitely a key issue for conservation of European mink. And what is also important is the breeding operation, because through the breeding operation we could actually make sure that the captive population, what we have, the conservation breeding, which can be used as a backup if you fail in a wild, could actually be effective. And finally, it's really important that this European mink working group, which is established, will be supported, respected, so it could really have the impact to the process in Romania. And what I can say is that we can expect quite strong actions from IUCN Species Survival Commission towards Romanian government, because it's not only the problem of European mink, but some other species as well. So it seems that the IUCN is trying to do some actions to force the government to do at least something. Spain and France, the future challenges, I think I'm standing apart, and it's actually interesting to see that the points which Madis was raising are actually basically the same which was in my ideas: conservation breeding, long-term effective American mink control, monitoring, planned reintroduction, possibly following IUCN guidelines, and of course again public awareness. In Russia, I think there are two main points which is really important, is to try to get the way of the European mink status somehow on these two areas in which we really have good evidence that the mink is present. And secondly, actually also to promote captive breeding program in a frame of Russian-speaking zoo federation in Russia. It's also partly because of that is making it possible to get additional funders for conservation breeding program, but not only because through the conservation breeding it's actually easy to highlight the importance of this species in a country. Estonia, we have two major things to do: habitat improvement in Hume Island and the release operation on the second island, which we hope to start within coming few years, which is depending upon securing the funding for that. Future challenges in ex situ conservation. There's quite a bit of challenges. First, which we have been talking, is the Spanish and EP population merging together. And definitely the genetic research have to be continued. It will not be enough what we've done so far. And there is also political issues which have to be solved, because on one side we have breeding program which belongs to the government, and the other side we have the breeding program which is run by zoo association. So it's probably need to do a lot of meetings actually to find a common ground how to run this kind of breeding program. It's clear that if we have all European mink breeding programs, then we have to structure it somehow. So we could have a subpopulation, let's say the breeding captive breeding program, sub-program in Spain, in France, in Eastern Europe, and so on. And so far, the overall model how the breeding programs are functioning have not foreseen this kind of structuring. So we have to think how to do it in a way that it could actually be effective in maintaining the gene diversity in the overall captive population. One thing which is really important, I think Madis also mentioned it already, that we need to have committed facilities in breeding programs, which have more than 10 animals, which are focusing and breeding in this one, because only in this one we could get over the male problem, like we call it in breeding programs, that some of the males tend to be too aggressive or too passive. And one thing which is very specific for the zoo community is that the European mink tends not to be a good zoo animal, because you don't see it so much, it's hiding it all the time. So what to do to make it more attractive to the public, which would increase interest in zoos to keep it in a captivity? And one possibility for that is actually to develop the training techniques which are widely used in the zoos nowadays. It's kind of communication between human and animal, using positive enforcement to make it for the animal easier to understand what the human being wants to him. So the animals are not afraid so much. But basically the very same kind of techniques could be used to trigger natural behavior of the animals in artificial conditions. So it could be easier to have a look on the visitors, and in this way to make this animal more attractive for zoo audience, and that would mean also for the zoos. So on the inefficient breeding, males breeding, solving problem, that's something that we've been working on for 15 years. We have published quite a bit of articles, but we still don't know what is causing it. So definitely the behavioral research has to continue. But a part of that, because we don't know when we find the key how to get over the problem, the biobanking gametes and also cryopreservation of stem cells is something we have to look at, just to be sure that the gene diversity, which we actually lose every year because quite a part of males are not taking part in breeding, we could preserve them for the use in the future. Adding founders, that's definitely an important thing. And that is the reason why I was mentioning the breeding program to start in Romania and also in Russia. And we could also make the captive breeding more genetically diverse. And finally, what is really starting to be an important point is joint management of ex situ and in situ population. Because I'm quite sure that quite soon in Spain, you have wild population which have been restored by using in situ, ex situ populations. And then you have the population which origin is from captivity in a wild, and you have the captive population. And you could change the animals, but you don't know how these animals will relate to each other, which makes the management really a complication. And right now, in the model which is used in captive breeding, this kind of situation has not foreseen. So it's kind of thing which have to be developed in few years. It's not only the problem of the European mink, it's a problem a lot of endangered species that we start to have wild population restored by use of the captive population. But if you make a joint management of the two populations, we have to have tools to know what we are doing and how we are doing. And that's actually quite a challenge. And finally, I'm coming to the future challenges in a policy level. And I think we have two major challenges in a political level in related to the European mink. One is invasive species regulation to get it into the list. Because once we have it into the list, the decision making on the American mink fur farming and control in the countries will be delegated to the European Commission, which means that the decision can be done in a way that it's the same for the whole region. And that would mean that we could actually make EU minimum standards for farming, which could help us actually to reduce the escapees from the mink farms in a very similar way like it is done in Denmark. Because right now, the system is quite perfect in Denmark, it's pretty good in Estonia. But if it's not actually implemented at all in Romania or in some other countries, those escapees coming from these farms actually are causing a lot of problems. The second thing is actually that we have to try to start to implement polluter pays principles, because all the escapees which are coming from farms is actually pollution. But so far it has been complicated to trace back the origin of the animals, American minks, found in a wild to the mink farm. I mean these ones which were just escaped, not feral ones. But if we could find the technology how to identify it, we could actually start to find the mink farms if they are not following the minimum standards. And then we could actually do all European scale identification of ecologically sensitive areas in which mink farming should be fully prohibited. And finally, if we really have biologically sensitive areas, then we could actually start to make focused eradication program like the one which has been going on in Spain right now. And finally, and that might seem to be quite awkward, the idea to include European mink to the annex of Convention of Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals. You could ask that, is a European mink a migratory bird or a migratory mammal? Definitely it's not. And it seems really awkward, but the issue is that this convention is not nowadays anymore so much a convention about the migratory species, but it's more like a tool to make cross-border collaboration between the countries. For instance, last year, gobi bear was included to the convention, and basically all the large African carnivore species, they are not migratory at all. But being in the Appendix 1, that will require international agreement for the conservation and management, which means being in a list actually will open a policy tool, a policy instrument for collaboration between the European governments, so we could have a joint effort for the conservation of this species. And that's all what I had to talk. Thank you.